number of speakers from around the country and around international communities to talk about the ways in which indigeneity and other ideas around ways in which Native peoples understand themselves in the world is a site for critical engagement with the university and back with the communities to talk about ideas of reciprocity, responsibility, and sovereignty and political action in the world. Tonight, it's our very great pleasure to be able to welcome back Joseph Gahn from University of Michigan. He got his PhD here. And I'm never very good at these things to introduce and start, but I was the one chosen to do it. So I guess with that, I'm going to ask Helen Neville, who's a full professor in educational psychology and African American studies, to come up and introduce Joe Gahn for us. And thank you so much for doing that.
The only reason why I'm going to stand here is because I have my little paper here. So good evening, everyone. It's so nice to see a full group of folks here. I am so honored to be here, to be able to do this introduction and welcome back Dr. Joseph Gahn. I was meeting with some colleagues this morning and was talking about how excited I was and how honored I was to be able to introduce him. And they were like, yeah, you're right, that is an honor. So I'm just really excited. As Jody said, that Dr. Gahn is an assistant professor of psychology and American culture at the University of Michigan, and he's an enrolled member of the Gros-Ventre tribe of Montana. So since his graduation in clinical and community psychology here in 2001, he's been incredibly productive in some meaningful ways. So not only has he been productive, but he has pushed the field forward in helping us think through how we think about culture and psychology in some deep structural and meaningful ways. So just a quick look at his CV. He's got over 20 publications in which he's pushing the envelope in these important ways. He's published broadly in some important kind of journals, critical, recognized journals such as American Journal of Community Psychology and Professional Psychology, but also he's kept his roots to looking at publishing in journals that focus on culture, which many times are minimized within our field, such as cultural diversity and ethnic minority psychology. He's got over 60 national and international scholarly presentations. He also has some important book chapters in books that deal with indigenous healing, such as Healing Traditions, the Mental Health of Aboriginal Peoples, and Aboriginal Healing in Canada. So it's got some good pieces there. In addition, he's grounded in terms of what we traditionally do as psychologists as well, and has been recognized in some of his efforts that way. So for example, he's authored a technical report on Native American suicide prevention in communities, and that was sponsored by the National Institute of Health. He's got a ton of honors and fellowships and scholarships that he's received. I won't go into all of them, but I will name a couple of them. He's an American Indian Ambassador. He was a distinguished visitor faculty at the University of Alberta. He's had several important postdocs, whether it's the Ford postdoc or the Kellogg postdoc fellowship for minority health disparities. He was also received funding for a project sponsored by the Indian Health Service and National Institute of General Medical Sciences. Just real briefly, I wanted to contextualize the importance of his work because I think he's quite young in his professional development, but he's making these leaps and bounds in terms of how we as psychologists are thinking about culture in some pretty important ways. And what I see, although I don't think he probably agrees, but I see like similar to issues folks that do critical race theory, I think his use of storytelling and counter-storytelling to name one's reality is an important methodology for us as psychologists to claim. I also think that his look at and changing how we think about culture in a deep, structural way is pretty important. And so we have this young scholar who says, I'm a psychologist, but I'm going to shift things and completely think outside of the box, but still be a psychologist in how we do that. And how can other disciplines inform that? So he's showing us how we can do this and showing us the way, which I think is pretty exciting. So please join me in welcoming home Dr. Joseph Gahn as he presents his presentation, which I think we're in a real treat for, Keeping Culture in Mind, Therapeutic Integration in a First Nation Treatment Center.
That was stunning. Wow. You know, you have these moments in your career where certain thresholds are crossed or whatever. That's the first time I ever received that kind of introduction. There's no way I can live up to that. Thank you, Helen. That was too kind. Wow. Can you all hear okay? Sounds funny back here. Does it sound okay out there? Too loud. I'm rigged up with a couple of different mics, so I'm a little scared to adjust. John? All right, great. Thanks. It's a pleasure to come back to Illinois. I left here in 1997 to go off and finish dissertation research and so on. At that time, of course, Chief Alaniwak was dancing along, and there was no Indian studies, and there were very few, if any, Native faculty. And so now, 10 years later, it's remarkable to see the progress this campus has made, and I know there are lots of important people who've advocated for that kind of change, and people who eventually got into power who were able to bring about such changes, so it's really a treat, and I commend all of you who are supportive of these efforts, and the Faculty of Indian Studies who are hosting me here today, and all of you who came out, thank you. I hope I can live up to your expectations today. Let's start with a brief positioning of myself and then a little bit of statement of some of the general themes I want to address today in this presentation. As Helen said, I'm a Grovant person who's trained in academic clinical psychology, as it's been influenced substantially both by what has reemerged as cultural psychology and what endures as community psychology. And in particular, my research interests lay at the intersection of culture and mental health. I examine a set of cultural, political, and ethical quandaries at the interface of conventional mental health services and indigenous customs and practices in post-colonial Native America, the post being in parentheses because there's a lot of ambiguity around that. The general themes I want to touch on today.
Sorry, how do I go back?
The opposite arrow. I think just go backward one. Excellent, great, and I'll signal you. Thanks, Debbie, for doing this. I want to consider for us three themes today, essentially the convergences and divergences of cultural practice in post-colonial societies. Obviously, I'm going to be talking about a native society, but I think some of these issues transcend. The complex interplay between dominant and subjugated knowledges and subjectivities, and the ethical and political implications of mental health services in post-colonial contexts. Debbie, please. So we have a specific problem that I'm trying to address, essentially, which has to do with the culture of the therapeutic in Native American communities today. No one disputes that there is a persistent prevalence of community distress and dysfunction in many reservation or reserve communities. Also, it's impossible to dispute that there's a proliferating presence of community-controlled programs and services in Indian country that are designed to redress these kinds of distress and dysfunction. But there are a couple of challenges that we need to attend to, owing to, first of all, the historical divergences in therapeutic practices between the West and indigenous communities, and the contemporary commitment in many indigenous communities to therapeutic integration of traditional and Western modalities. And so really the specific purpose of my talk today is to consider the prospects and pitfalls that inhere in Native community efforts to integrate therapeutic traditions and practices in the context of a specific community case study that I undertook a few years back. Essentially, I went to a reserve in Canada, a northern Algonquian First Nation community in Manitoba. And this community was interesting for a lot of reasons. It enjoyed a hunting and trapping economy really up until the 1970s, when Manitoba Hydro flooded most of their homelands and altered their patterns and practices of life quite dramatically. The result had been a great deal of distress and dysfunction in the community, and so an established healing lodge was formed in the late 1990s to address primarily substance abuse treatment issues, but other mental health or wellness issues as well. And this healing lodge was quite distinctive in several ways. It was band-controlled, which is not always the case, particularly in Canada. In the United States, it's more common, but in Canada, not so common. It was tribally staffed, 23 staff members who were all members of this particular group, with only one exception who was a member of a different band. And it was regionally accredited by Health Canada, which is a big deal because it's one thing to have a community-controlled program, to actually be accredited so that patients could come from all over the country and be paid for services through Health Canada was distinctive. Three components to the program you should know about: an inpatient program in which patients or participants would come for 4 months and reside to cope with substance abuse problems. An outpatient program which was geared, obviously, an outpatient basis to the reserve community, but which had as its focus the legacy of the residential schools, which includes substance abuse issues, of course, but also other kinds of issues pertaining to perhaps sexual abuse or physical abuse in childhood, loss of culture and language, and the various sequelae of the residential schools. And finally, there was a referral component as well, whose job was to kind of assess people and try to persuade them to go to treatment either at the Healing Lodge itself or in other treatment programs in Canada. Let's take a look here at the explicit goals of the Healing Lodge program. This is just taken directly from their statement of purpose. A resourceful community healing place, so not treatment, right, but healing place, that maintains our tribal language, culture, and spirituality. To provide direct, purposefully designed, and culturally appropriate community therapeutic support services, and to provide an integrated and holistic therapeutic approach to healing and wellness for individuals, families, and the community, utilizing Western and Aboriginal practices. So, integrated and holistic, Western and Aboriginal. It's important to note, I think, for the purposes of context and the rest of the talk, that many of the clients who participated in this program were compelled or coerced in various ways. So it's not very common that someone would come voluntarily and say, gee, I've not been doing so well, please let me take advantage of your services. You know, they were in trouble with the law, or their kids had been taken away, and this was a prerequisite before the court would award jurisdiction or so on. So it was more common than not that people were compelled to participate in one form or another. And again, I want to just accentuate that the explicit commitment in this program's activities to integrating Aboriginal healing practices and Western therapeutic modalities was really what caught my attention. Next slide. The nature of the research is what I call quasi-ethnographic research, in part because it wasn't real sustained participant observation. I was there 7 weeks total, which most anthropologists would laugh at, I think. But it was concerned with understanding the models and the metaphors of healing as it unfolded in this treatment center. This was one of 5 case studies of these kinds of programs funded by the Aboriginal Healing Foundation in Canada, which received several $100 million from the Crown to redress the residential school legacy in Canada, and awarded treatment funds to many, many different reserves throughout the country. And near the end of their mission, they wanted to document and describe what had some of these programs looked like so they wouldn't need to recreate the wheel in the future should some community decide to start a similar program. Essentially, the models of healing had to do simply with a description of what does therapeutic practice look like in this setting. Here's an opportunity. A band gets money to provide healing for the legacy of the residential schools. So what do? And in terms of metaphors, we're interested in what does healing mean in this particular therapeutic context. So we wanted both a description and an excavation, if you will, of the discourse surrounding healing in this particular setting. My distinctive focus, beyond what the other case studies did, was to ask what are the prospects and pitfalls of integrating Aboriginal healing traditions and Western therapeutic modalities within an accredited healthcare institution. So I wanted to bring additional cultural analysis to this question of therapeutic integration. I mentioned 7 weeks of participant observation. It was across 3 different visits. Personal circumstances intervened a couple of times, but I was able to conduct a number of interviews with staff and clients. The clients were really a convenient sample of folks who the therapists were willing to hustle in from the community to talk to me. As a result, they were disproportionately graduates of the program as opposed to folks who hadn't really taken hold or maintained through the whole project. And community members as well, some board members, some residential school survivors, and so on. A total of 33 different interviews that I transcribed and had a chance to analyze. And you can see here, administrators involved in the project were 3, counselors 4, clients 11. And this was all of the counselors in the program, and as I said, a convenient sample of the clients. In addition to the participant observation and to the interviews themselves, I had access to the different documents of the lodge to understand better what they said about themselves and the kinds of intake they conducted and so on. And there is a bit of an extant ethnographic record as well around these folks. So this project, in terms of the cultural contextualization, wouldn't have been able to happen in only 7 weeks if there hadn't been a real good anthropological documentation for some of the cultural practices of these people. Again, my focus was the outpatient program, redressing residential school legacy. I'm working on writing up this project in some ways this year as a fellow at the School for Advanced Research. And I'm going to go into beyond the outpatient program in particular, but today we're just talking about that program with its 4 counselors and the clients we're talking about here. I undertook a content analysis, essentially, of the interviews as contextualized by the other sources of evidence I've told you about. And I did offer somewhat greater attention to the discourse of the staff around healing, in part because you can imagine that staff and clients have a differential take and facility with what healing might mean because they have different expertise and different experiences. And I also had a somewhat greater dependence on the interview data themselves, in part because of the limited time that I was there. These are ongoing analyses, but I did focus principally today on the therapeutic discourse, and especially among the outpatient staff and clients that I interacted with. So let's go through some results that emerged so far. First was a notion I call wounded healers. And so this has to do with the therapists in the program. These were all native therapists. Most of them were from this particular community. They had all experienced very challenging life circumstances. They themselves would say they were survivors of residential school, survivors of sexual abuse or physical abuse or neglect, survivors of very difficult, often childhood kinds of histories and circumstances. And they had all, at some point in their lives, turned their lives around by embarking on some process of therapeutic recovery. In effect, they all embraced the notion of a healing journey. They all readily acknowledged to everyone they were on a healing journey, and part of their healing journey had taken them into this profession to help others like them to embark on a healing journey as well. So personal experience was really the most important source of expertise. They often had credentials of various kinds at maybe the associate's degree level or even less than that, certificates of various kinds. These weren't folks who had gone to university for 4-year degrees or anything like that. They had gotten what they could along the way, and so personal experience was really important, and that in part was because there were pretty limited opportunities for formal training for these folks. So these are the therapists, essentially. Let's move to consider the therapeutic practices in particular. Now, I mentioned that they were committed, obviously, to integrating Western approaches and traditional approaches. So let's look at what they meant in terms of the discourse of healing in describing these various approaches. The Western approaches were most primarily and principally grounded in 12 steps and 12 traditions of Alcoholics Anonymous. This is probably true of almost any treatment center in North America that you can go to that's devoted to substance abuse issues. But in addition to this, there were lots of other stuff too. They talked about inner child exploration, grief exercises, anger discharge, energy work of various kinds, guided imagery, meditation, visualization, relaxation training, genogram mapping, Reiki, neurolinguistic programming, acupuncture. And there's probably some that I didn't actually remember to record along those lines. So we can see here in some respects that what they label as Western has to do really not with what might be most familiar to doctorally trained mental health professionals. These are alternative or complementary and alternative kinds of approaches that are grounded principally in conventional substance abuse treatment, but also pop psychology, complementary and alternative medicine, even New Age treatments. And it reflects in part the stuff that was regionally available to these folks when seminars or workshops were available that they could travel to try and brush up their skills. So I think what's useful to mention is that these are not what you might call evidence-based practices or empirically supported treatments for substance abuse that are certainly out there. There are a laundry list of these programs that have been scientifically assessed in terms of the relationship of intervention to outcome. That's not what these folks are doing. And I think in part it has to do with the limited access to training, but it's also, I think, a rejection of the very secular nature of most of those kinds of interventions. So I think the principle here is that anything that has sacred, esoteric insights, mysterious energies, anything having to do with spirituality in some broad brushstroke and the therapeutic was appealing. And so anything that could lay claim to spiritual therapeutic intervention was of interest. So what then of the Aboriginal approaches? There were several of these evident as well. Smudging rites, it's not high ceremony, but a smudging rite, talking circles, blessing rites of various kinds, tobacco offerings, pipe ceremonies, sweat lodge rituals, fasting camps, and the shaking tent lodge were all in evidence in this community, and particularly at the Healing Center. And I think it's worth noting that there was not programmatic incorporation of herbal medicines or the kinds of pharmacotherapy that traditional practitioners might be aware of. It was all around the lines of symbolic healing or symbolic ritual. And it's, I think, useful to recognize that these were really institutionalized modalities. It wasn't just, well, let's see if we can have one of these when someone comes through. There were weekly sweat lodges on Thursday afternoon at this time, led by this person, and clients were all encouraged to come. There was a full-time traditional counselor, in fact, whose job was to be the traditional counselor, hired under that rubric. And many of the staff, out of the 23, there were 7 who identified as traditional pipe carriers. It's not always exactly clear what that meant to the person who was claiming it, but that's what they said. There were, in fact, Aboriginal approaches or practices that were in evidence here. And along with that, you might expect, of course, that there were contestations of what Aboriginal culture really is and who can authentically practice it and whether it's valid or not. So there were contestation or dispute over the role that Pan-Indianism ought to play in this community. A number of these things are not native to this particular community throughout history. They come from the sharing and trading of traditions, particularly in modern times, between different communities. And some community members felt like that was great, because anything that can help us as Native people find ourselves is good. Others felt like that was a threat to the indigenous traditions that we're interested in preserving. Peyote, as you can imagine, in many Indian substance abuse treatment programs is controversial. So it's sort of interesting that the traditional counselor was really known, as he told me, and others told me, as kind of the go-to guy for Native American church stuff in this region of the country. But of course, no one wanted to have an intoxicating substance in use for healing of those who abuse intoxicating substances because of the politics of that. And so it was actually literally in his contract that he was not to mention peyote or to conduct any kind of peyote ritual in terms of association with his job. One counselor who was not especially happy with how things unfolded railed against the so-called popcorn elders that had appeared among the therapeutic staff there. And by popcorn elder, he was referring to the fact that a Cracker Jack box where you open it up and you take out a plastic token. And he was using this as a critique of what he viewed to be as inauthentic and fairly superficial conversion to Indian ritual and spiritual practice by some of the folks involved in the center. That's one area of contestation about how authentic, how much do people really know, do they practice more than they think they know, etc. And all of this is cast within the efforts at traditionalization of various kinds of practices in which people might be willing to say, well, yes, this came from whatever context, New Age context, an Eastern mysticism context, but we have something just like it that's been from time immemorial. And so there was the kind of re-traditionalization of some modern practices that people found important for the efforts here. So obviously institutionalized Aboriginal healing traditions that were clearly at work here with the accompanying contestations that you might expect if you're familiar with Indian country. Now recall that one goal of the program here was to provide an integrated and holistic therapeutic approach to healing and wellness for individuals, families, and the community, utilizing Western and Aboriginal practices. The importance of Aboriginal practices, as I observed, was conveyed through the vision and mission statements of the Healing Lodge. So the vision statement, which had been articulated really just before I had arrived, was paving the red road to wellness, with the mission statement being medicine wheel fire keepers, empowering healthy lifestyles. One administrator elaborated on these statements as follows. Quote, "The mission has been revised to state that we are medicine wheel fire keepers empowering healthy lifestyles." I mean, those statements are memorable. They're imbued with the symbolism of our people. The medicine wheel takes in everything that we know, have known, and can accommodate what is to be known. The medicine wheel is that encompassing. Fire keepers are simply helpers, and that's how we view ourselves. It's not the keepers of the medicine wheel teachings, but rather the helpers keeping those teachings alive and well and palatable for a growing number of our people. Another administrator added, quote, "Even our vision statements, we wanted to make them unique to the Aboriginal. We're going to put that medicine wheel there because we don't just want a vision statement that any white person can use. We want it to be unique. We want it to stand out too, so that when they read it, they'll know it's an Aboriginal vision statement." So my point here is to observe that the diverse therapeutic activities of the Healing Lodge are unified by their conceptual assimilation within the powerful Aboriginal symbol of the medicine wheel. So, what is the medicine wheel? Well, as used throughout Indian country in therapeutic settings, the medicine wheel is a representation of a circle bisected by 2 perpendicular lines that cross at the center point, terminate at the outer edge. These lines yield 4 spokes at right angles to each other that demarcate 4 quadrants within the circle. So conceptually, this symbol is meant to represent the holistic balance and integration of 4 constituent parts within a unitary totality. It's all right, just the next one's fine, it's fine. So 4 constituent parts integrated within a unitary totality. These 4 ways are represented spatially, for example, with the prototype being the cardinal directions, east, south, west, and north. And the second significant aspect of the medicine wheel is the cyclical representation of time, with the prototype being the 4 seasons, spring, summer, winter, and fall. So the medicine wheel then images the unity of directional space and cyclical time within a coherent whole. Thus, the evident conceptual advantage of the medicine wheel is an explicit recognition that any element considered in detached isolation from the other 3 distorts reality, yielding disharmony and disintegration. And as you might expect, endless phenomena can be accommodated to the medicine wheel: the races of humanity, totemic animals, sacred plants, and so on. Why don't you go ahead and click the hyperlink, would you please? Great. In lodge activities, the most important of these various phenomena that were accommodated in the medicine wheel have to do with the human experience. And the emphasis on 4 basic constituents was linked to the very essence of native personhood. So, quote, "I mentioned earlier this evening that a return to the medicine wheel teachings entails a return to everything that is, that was, and that can be known. In former times, an Indian person lived by certain values. We say Nyanaway in our language, Nyanaway. When you ask a native speaker what this word means, 90% of them will tell you, speak this language. When in fact, the meaning of that word is much deeper because it talks about who you are and what you are. Nyanaway. There's a root word in there that speaks to a number. Now, in our language, is 4. In other words, speak and think in the 4 ways of who and what you are. What that means is we are a people who move and behave in 4 ways. Not surprisingly, then, the medicine wheel is used then in this context and others to characterize human psychology. It outlines for us, at least as these folks utilized it, a topography of the self. One counselor noted, quote, "It just all boils down to mind, body, spirit, emotion. Mind, body, spirit, emotion. Those 4 aspects of our being have to be involved in a kind of healing activity." And it's used then to render also the full human lifespan. So you can accommodate the 4 stages of human development, or the 4 seasons of life, from dependency at birth to dependency in old age, through childhood, adolescent, adult, and so on. And the explicit efforts of the counseling staff were directed to instruction of clients in the therapeutic implications of the medicine wheel. One counselor said, quote, "I try to make people understand about the medicine wheel concept. The medicine wheel is a concept, it's an idea, it's a philosophy. It's not something that you can carry around with you in your pocket. You can use that concept, you can use those teachings in every aspect of your life because it includes the whole universe. We are but a speck of that whole universe, but we are interrelated, and we are part of the whole universe as we see it. The medicine wheel teaches us the good way of life. It teaches us all about our being, not just our mental, not just our physical, not just our emotional, not just our spiritual, but all of it." In sum, then, therapeutic integration was achieved principally in symbolic terms by subsuming diverse therapeutic techniques and practices, the Aboriginal, the Western, within an overarching orientation to selfhood provided by the medicine wheel. Next slide. So let's turn now then beyond the therapeutic symbolism to therapeutic discourse. What was the meaning of healing in this particular setting? In this study, healing was seen to have distinctive explicit and implicit meanings. So let's look first and quickly at the explicit meanings of healing. Healing was explicitly described as an ongoing process that involved, here's a laundry list, a cultivation of appreciation, a repudiation of judgmental self-righteousness, an understanding of one's past, an acceptance of difficult realities, dealing with problems head-on, getting to know oneself, finding one's purpose in life. Moreover, healing for this community was understood by lodge staff to require a post-colonial reclamation of cultural identity and ritual practice. So beyond the kind of individual aspects here, it was also about linking the self to a refinding of one's identity and one's place within a native community that was thriving in some important sense. One administrator described the connection between identity and lifestyle succinctly. Quote, "Because I believe, and nobody has been able to convince me otherwise, that a person who knows who and what they are simply makes healthier lifestyle decisions." In sum, healing was described as a process of positive existential transformation stemming from activities and insights that effectively link to the imperfect and vulnerable self to a more hopeful and compelling sense of purpose. Such purpose, it was assumed, was conducive to valued and meaningful engagement in the world. Now, this is a summary portrait of the explicit meanings of healing. It's a synthesis of many perspectives and experiences. No one individual said, okay, here's healing, and laid this out. So in some ways, this is an analytic statement about what healing meant in terms of the discourse observed in this setting. Next slide. There was another sense, however, in which healing was implicitly understood and latently practiced in the programs at the Healing Lodge that was shared by nearly everyone involved, whether as clients, counselors, or administrators. In this latter sense, healing indexed the power of talk to purge personal pain toward the refashioning of a more functional self. In essence, it was a talking cure. Everyone in the setting talked about talk. Counselors observed how challenging it was to get their clients to talk in group meetings or in one-on-one counseling. Clients recalled extreme discomfort about staff expectations concerning therapeutic talk, especially during their initial transition into lodge activities. The difficulties associated with eliciting therapeutic talk from clients was attributed in part to enduring cultural norms governing verbal communication. Therapists actually said, we don't really do this, and that's why it's so hard for them. And finally, healing was universally understood to require engagement of clients in therapeutic talk, and this was premised on three closely related assumptions. Emotional burdens being the first. So, first, the therapeutic utility of talk was grounded in the belief that lodge clients carried deep personal pain as a result of traumatic or devastating experiences earlier in life, oftentimes during childhood. And these experiences frequently are attributed in some fashion to colonial disruptions of community life, including the atrocities of the Canadian residential school system. The resultant emotional burdens were understood to weigh heavily upon client lives, continually overloading or derailing individual efforts to find serenity or happiness. All of the counselors were familiar with the effects of these emotional burdens. Here's one quote. Some of our Aboriginal people experienced emotional, mental, physical, and sexual abuse. Because of those experiences, a lot of them never recovered. A lot of them had turned to alcohol as a means of escape. A lot of them didn't get the counseling they needed because the counseling services weren't available in their reserve, or the mental health or the psychologists that come in now. They never dealt with their issues. And some of them never have had an opportunity to talk about what they experienced. And they may end up crying when they're talking to you because they need to be able to talk about it. A lot of them didn't talk about it. They kept it inside, and then it just built up like a pressure cooker. Another counselor said, we have a lot of people yet that can't open up. Whatever happened over there, they just as soon leave it over there. But the thing is, it doesn't stay over there. It stays with them. And that's what they have to realize, that it doesn't go away until they deal with it. Face it head on. And yeah, we've had people break down in tears. And I've had some people are so overcome by emotion they go into convulsions. We've had people like that. That's how powerful these traumatic experiences can be. There's a lot of cases where a lot of psychological damage was done, and a lot of it will probably never be touched upon or even revisited there. People have gone to their graves with a lot of grief, a lot of sorrow, a lot of hurt, a lot of pain. And one counselor brought in his own personal experience. I carried my sexual abuse for 40 years before I was able to talk about it. And I can imagine a lot of our Native people today are carrying a lot of heavy, heavy stuff that you can't unload. And then we wonder why you turn to alcohol. That's the reason I turned to alcohol, to numb the pain. Because that's what it does, it numbs the pain. And so today we address social problems, and oftentimes right away we label it, well, it's an alcohol problem or a drug problem. Personally, I don't see it that way because there's something far beyond that. That person has an alcohol problem for another reason, for something bigger than that. So the key concept here is that past personal pain, if unconfronted or unexpressed, can undermine present-day functioning. Thus, in order to gain relief from such harmful burdens, dealing with or facing head-on one's traumatic past is required. And one prescribed means to releasing these burdens, then, was cathartic expression. Thus, secondly, Healing required, above all, the release of painful emotional burdens through the acknowledgement and confession of past ordeals. On this point, at the Lodge, there was utter consensus. Therapeutic relief was obtained through disclosure and the resultant emotional catharsis. The counselors themselves had experienced such release. Quote, I find that pain and that not disclosing is buried inside you. And if you want to keep it there and let it always bother you, then that's your choice. But if you disclose it, it's your healing. It's your healing. But if you bury it and don't want to say nothing about it, then it's going to affect your life, I think. It affected mine. The funny thing about mine is I had it buried so deep, and there was just an exercise and social work training that we were doing. I don't know what happened, but something dug way down inside and triggered me to just almost bluntly disclose. I just got very, very emotional. After I said that I'd been sexually abused, I could have jumped on the fence and flew over the building. Moreover, these counselors sought to orchestrate the same kinds of disclosure and catharsis in their clients. Quote, and our clients just can't bring themselves to talking about their pain in public, in that group. But sooner or later, they realize that they'll have to talk about it in order to address it. And for that reason, when they talk about it one-on-one, then they can really lay it on the line and say, yeah, I've experienced that, this is how I did it, this is what happened, and this is how I feel. So they're able to address all those areas. And then once they do that, then they're okay with it. All but one of the clients I interviewed explicitly endorsed this principle of cathartic expression in one form or another. Here's just one example. Quote, what I find most helpful was, I guess, the one-on-one with that counselor. She encouraged me to take some risks, even if some story sounds silly, just to talk, bring it out. Even if I felt like it wasn't necessary to talk about this story or that story, just to bring it out. Well, for one thing, I always felt silly about being sexually molested by a nurse in the hospital. I didn't really talk about those things before. I never really showed anyone in the group the real me. But it taught me how to express that, and express how I really felt inside me, and bring it out. And that really helped. It took a lot of weight out of my shoulders, and I felt lightened after that, when I was finally able to cry in front of other people without being ashamed or stuff like that, without even being shy. I just went to show that I'm human, just like everybody else. Thus, given the wide prevalence of cathartic disclosure in the interviews of Lodge staff and clients alike, it'd be difficult to identify a more central tenet of the meaning of healing in this setting than that involving the verbal expression of deeply painful experience in service to emotional catharsis. So the key concept here, right, is that suppression plus denial yields misery or pathology, but that disclosure plus catharsis yields release or healing. One counselor said it best. Quote, a lot of those people out there need one-on-one counseling. Talk to me. Let's dig it out. Let's talk. Let's begin our healing journey. Finally, in terms of the tenets of healing, in the implicit sense, was this notion of self as project introspection. None of the counseling staff and clients claimed that disclosure and catharsis was the sum total of healing. More specifically, cathartic self-expression was expected to inaugurate a process of self-examination and searching reflexivity that could sustain positive and ongoing transformations of the self. Thus, thirdly, healing required a form of introspection that renders the self as a therapeutic project. In colloquial terms, looking at oneself seemed necessary for healing. Here's a counselor, quote, so that's what they learn here in our program, is that they need to take responsibility for their own lives. And sometimes, yes, it's good that they're forced to take a look at themselves. Because sometimes we have to be forced. And once they're able to look at where they've come from, they learn different ways on how to cope. Again, clients also seem to have adopted this perspective. Quote, so when they started this healing lodge here, that's where I learned everything. I thought it was only just to maintain your sobriety. That was good enough for me. That was my thinking. Well, okay, I'm sober. Good. But little did I know I had to go further. To have that healthy lifestyle, you've got to look at your attitude, your thinking, your behavior. You've got to look at yourself emotionally, mentally, physically, and spiritually in order to have that balance of living. Such searching self-examination could only yield deeper insights in service to positive self-transformation. In essence, then, a refashioning of the self became the therapeutic project that required consistent attention, inspiration, and insight. Such refashioning was colloquially referred to as, quote, working on oneself. Here's a counselor, quote, but over time, when I got to working on myself and getting better, getting well, it became easier. It became easier because I could honestly talk about meaningful issues in any relationship and truthfully talk from my heart instead of pretending or making up long stories or just for the sake of sounding good. And one administrator summarized it, quote, the lodge is a place to heal. is somebody they can talk to. It's a place where they can get the support, where they're not judged. Because it's a place where they can get support, and I guess to encourage their own personal development. That's what it is. It's support. It's help. Providing the supports for people that want to work on themselves. Those are the more successful clients, are the ones that come here because they want to be here and they want to learn something. Yes, it just creates self-awareness for them. Thus, working on oneself, one's issues, or one's life was emblematic of the healing journey that signifies this lifelong process of introspection, insight, transformation, and fulfillment, with the key concepts obviously being self-examination, self-awareness, and working on yourself. In conclusion, then, the meaning of healing as it was understood and practiced by staff and clients at the Lodge might be summarized as an ongoing process of positive self-transformation, fueled by introspection, reflexivity, insight, disclosure, catharsis, dealing with one's problems, working on oneself, and finding one's purpose as an Aboriginal person, that ultimately reoriented fragile and often damaged selves toward a more meaningful and compelling engagement in the world. Of course, these notions are not especially idiosyncratic to the respondents in this community, but in fact comprise an increasingly globalized culture of the therapeutic. This therapeutic culture is succinctly characterized by a number of people, but here I'll quote Stephen Ward from his 2002 book, Modernizing the Mind. Quote, "This triumph of the therapeutic, as Philip Reif referred to it, has contributed to a realignment of the way in which we experience, conceptualize, and represent our lives. People are expected, and under mandatory counseling, compelled to have psychological issues in need of resolution or expression. Failing to do so is a sign of being out of touch with one's psyche or in denial, and is itself an indication of the need for therapeutic intervention. Psychology's subjectivization of experience creates a number of taken-for-granted truths of contemporary life. The first of these truths is the notion of the deep down. This is the place where pathology or the true self resides in wait of release through confession, therapy, cognitive recognition, self-actualization, or perhaps a primal scream. The language of deep interiors characterize a true or authentic self that lies buried beneath the vicissitudes of modern life. People are expected to probe continuously their lives for repressed memories, neuroses, unhappy childhoods, or unresolved grief, because in these factors is said to reside both the truth about the self and the material needed for recovery and healing." My rather glib gloss of all of this is that this is Freud via pop psychology. At the outset of this study, I aspired to explore the models and metaphors of healing in this First Nation treatment center. And more specifically, I asked, what does therapeutic practice look like in this setting? I've tried to offer today a description of therapeutic practices. And I asked, what does healing mean in this therapeutic context? And I've offered here a characterization of therapeutic discourse. Perhaps most importantly, I asked, what are the prospects and pitfalls of integrating Aboriginal healing traditions and Western therapeutic modalities within an accredited healthcare institution? Next slide. In regard to the prospects for such integration, clearly the diverse therapeutic approaches of the Healing Lodge staff, subsumed by and unified in the symbolic discourse of the medicine wheel, were compelling for many Aboriginal clients. Among the clients interviewed for the study, a virtual consensus existed regarding the unique appeal of the program's distinctive offerings, yielding in some instances a remarkable transformation in client orientation and behavior. Even clients who continued to struggle with substance abuse and related distress acknowledged some progress toward improved coping with life's challenges. Recall, of course, though, that this was a select group of clients, most of whom were graduates and were picked by the staff for me to interview because they were considered successful in the program. The vast majority of people did not graduate from this program. In the time remaining, however, allow me to gesture briefly towards some perhaps or under-acknowledged predicaments of this sort of therapeutic integration. So turning to pitfalls. These pitfalls are grounded in the politics of cultural transaction in the very real aftermath of a brutal Euro-Canadian colonialism. Given the central emphasis on talk within the therapeutic discourse of the Lodge, and indeed the emphasis on the instrumental role of therapeutic talk in communicating vulnerability, expressing emotion, and constructing self, let us cast brief attention to the sociolinguistic heritage of this rather populous Northern Algonquian people. Here I'll turn very simply and briefly to anthropologist Regna Darnell, who's worked with the Eastern bands rather than the Midwestern bands of this group, but implies that at least some of her findings concerning the social parameters of talk probably apply to Native North American peoples in general. In contrast to the loud-mouthed Monia, or white man, these folks, according to Darnell, evidence a, quote, communicative pattern which characterizes most American Indian groups. I would claim that public and private or intimate behavior are sharply distinguished, with considerable social reticence being appropriate to the former. Talk in public is something to be monitored with great care. And she ties this explicitly to notions of personhood. Quote, Indians consider social interaction to be potentially dangerous, a face-threatening imposition on personal autonomy. Personal autonomy is the crucial factor. Ambiguity is desirable in interaction because it mitigates the potential danger of autonomous beings opening themselves to one another without reasonable certainty of a non-threatening response. And the metaphor used among these folks to describe social relations has to do with circles that intersect but definitely don't intrude or overlap into each other, and stars that pass each other in the night sky without obviously ever touching or colliding. And she continues, one cannot come too close without destroying the personness that interaction is based on. To protect his precious autonomy, it's often necessary not to talk. When one does talk, it's often necessary to talk indirectly. One must make no blatant claims on another being. It's inappropriate, for example, to pose a question so that an immediate and explicit response is required. Verbal input is deliberately kept minimal. Other cues, spatial positioning, relaxedness of posture, body alignment, synchrony of body motion, gestures, and so on, are used precisely because they are deniable. That is, there's little risk. And this, of course, moving first from talk, then to social relations, and now, to personhood, now to social relations, is embedded with this in this notion that these folks conceive interactions between social actors as basically asymmetrical. The one who speaks must have something to say which is not known to the addressee. Almost always one person is in control and the other, even when speaking, defers to that one. The elder speaking to the young person is the case par excellence, but it also applies in socially symmetrical interactions based on situational factors such as topic. If there is no asymmetry of knowledge, there's no need for verbal communication. Finally, she concludes, intimacy, then, is not a matter of a status differential. Rather, it's a matter of recognizing and accepting reciprocal social asymmetries. One individual completes another in the sense of social identity. There is a complementarity which does not jeopardize autonomy. And it's realized through this kind of indirectness and the ability to not make claims on other people's autonomy and to have deniable kinds of discourse. Obviously, there are a great many details to be sorted out in the ethnographic claims of Darnell and others. My purpose here is really quite unambitious. In reviewing just one article by one anthropologist concerning one facet of these people's cultural heritage, it seems self-evident that we are here engaged with construals of the self that diverge quite radically from those intrinsic to Western therapeutic culture. More specifically, self-expression in this cultural context has historically involved a great deal more reticence, especially in public venues, in comparison to Western communicative norms and practices. This reticence would appear to contrast markedly with the therapeutic discourse that prevails in the healing lodge. My point in all this is simply to recognize that even cursory engagement with the ethnographic record reveals that communicative behaviors can be grounded in ethno-psychological notions of self, personhood, and social relations, and how these in turn can be grounded in more extensive cosmologies and philosophies. We might expect then that such divergences will widen considerably once we venture beyond Darnell to consider the linguistic underpinnings of mind and emotion among this people as explicated by M.O. Junker, or the structure of knowledge cataloged for them by R.J. Preston, or the social relations with other than human persons described by R. Brightman, or the concepts of health elucidated by N. Adelson, or the extant healing traditions as discussed by J.M. Morse. But for now, let us remain focused on the issue at hand, namely, the understudied and underappreciated aspects of clinical intervention as communicative prescription, with sobering implications for selfhood. Despite explicit commitments and tangible efforts at integration, therapy culture remains central in the activities of the Healing Lodge, especially with regard to treatment objectives and targeted outcomes. Furthermore, these aspects of therapy culture were embraced with relatively uncritical enthusiasm by lodge staff, despite, one, what seemed to be rather profound cultural divergences in self, emotion, personhood, and communication, and two, otherwise explicit concerns about the ideological dangers of Euro-Canadian discursive power. A couple of caveats before we arrive. Integration and accreditation are unparalleled community achievements in Canada for this kind of a treatment center. So what I want to do before I tell you what worries I have is to take a moment to remind you this is a distinctive and celebratory achievement in many respects. My analyses are ongoing, so there's stuff that could still shift for me as we consider these problems. And there may be some possible communicative precedents for confession-like stuff pertaining to intersection with the Catholic Church and other kinds of things throughout history. And finally, there's this interesting question of traditionalization of practices in which something like energy work, which I gather is probably New Age in origin, is accommodated to some kind of philosophical, indigenous philosophical traditions in order to make it seem like it's part of us or has been part of us. And I don't want to dismiss that out of hand. The culture is always evolving, and we don't want to be romanticists about the past. But the provision of therapeutic services that are incommensurate with local thought and practice may in fact lead to a new form of colonial cultural proselytization of native recipients of these services. And I think what I want to leave you with here is the suggestion that the self may still serve as a site of neo-colonial engagement and resistance, even within a culturally committed, community-controlled treatment center in which Native people themselves run, organize, and administer the services. And I think it highlights a compelling post-colonial cultural quandary. How might accredited and credentialed programs and practitioners properly translate their culture of the therapeutic, grounded as it is in Western ways of knowing and being, into locally meaningful practices in Native communities that A, avoid undesirable Western cultural proselytization, even as they B, remain genuinely therapeutic? Hope we have some time to kick around the ideas. Thanks. Jody, you want me to stand and?
Yeah,
is it?
Say we're opening it up for questions.
Terrific. Great. Or comments. Don't have to be questions. Please.
I have a master's in counseling, and I'm very, I understand what you're saying, and I'm really excited about what you just talked about. Because even though I was energized, all the new knowledge I got from learning about Adler and all the and somewhat Carl Jung and a couple of other theories and models, and nothing, of course, was really for Native students. You know what I mean? Nothing was really for the population I intended to serve, and that disturbed me. But nevertheless, I was trained, even if I went to school for only 2.5 years to get my counseling degree, you get integrated into that field and get, in some ways, I mean, I don't want to say I was colonized, with that information, but in some degree you were, because and you have to almost decolonize yourself from learning all those theories in order to get that degree, you know what I mean? So my question is, even though they're Native, right, they still have a Western educational, right? Like, that's how you're approved as a counselor, is you have to get this certain type of education that's out there that is Western based. So it's really hard to, like, you know what I mean, like, check yourself about that and decolonize yourself from that experience.
In some ways, this is a process. This kind of therapeutic movement in Indian country is an imaginative process of adoption, adaptation, and rejection of a whole suite of, or a whole package of established kinds of approaches and procedures. And I think what happens is in the thrust of the overwhelming need, the fact that people can't work enough hours in the day under these particular modes to help people in the degree that's required in our communities. So there's not enough time to really step back and to question and challenge basic assumptions and to bring analytic, critical reasoning and to really formulate investigate alternatives that are substantive. You know, I think that kind of stuff comes with academic life, right? So that's why I have the pleasure and privilege of thinking about this stuff, because I get paid to think and write and read, right? And there's not a lot of people in therapeutic settings who have that privilege. So I think partnerships are good around folks who are academics and have that possibility with community people who are involved in the trenches, so to speak. Whether I'm optimistic about this, I'm not sure. I mean, I think on the one hand, you can reflect these kinds of perspectives back to folks, and I've done so among substance abuse treatment counselors in South Dakota, for example. And people say, wow, yeah, that's right. Yeah, what would it be like to think, you know, and then there's comes, but we have to get accredited or we don't get paid, and how do we get, so there are these institutional issues that are very powerful. But people get it pretty quickly, and I think, you know, again, finding partnerships for people who do have more time to do this kind of thing, and to persuade people that it might be worth an investment of contributing some energy and some attention to thinking about the alternatives from the ground up, if you will, in various local understandings to getting some of this done could be really useful. Again, I don't know how optimistic. I'm one person that wants to do this. There are other people, I'm sure, who would be willing to sign up for this kind of a project. But many people who go into the mental health professions do so because they want to earn a living, and there's a way of earning a living, and it's kind of a nice living. And whether those, you know, run-of-the-mill folks really want to engage in this kind of stuff, I'm not sure. Yeah. So that's why I think a little bit of effort could probably go a long way, but it's not going to carry us the whole way. Probably nothing can, I'm sorry to say. Yeah.
I was just going to say I was struck by one of the things that you said about the community and those healthcare workers then aren't just relying on Western science. Or there seemed to be a great deal of discussion about even Reiki and some of these other pop cultural ideas about therapy. So it seemed to me that there was an ongoing, if I heard you correctly, is this true, an ongoing sharing of different modes in trying to work in their community. Is this what I'm hearing? Yeah,
it's very assimilative of potentially interesting or important therapeutic modalities. So I was in a sweat lodge one afternoon with the clients, and one of the counselors kind of brought everything to a halt. It's dark, right? And she goes into a mini lecture, if you will, on the importance of the 7 sacred chakras and of stillness, space, and gravity. And talks for maybe 10 minutes about these kind of things. Well, 7 sacred chakras come somewhere from, you know, the East. And the stillness, space, and gravity came from a consultant that this community hired to help them in economic development activities. His name is Tolshi Sen. He's originally, I think, from Korea. He has an office in Toronto, and he basically markets himself to First Nation communities at $10,000 a month or whatever to help in economic development. His solution for economic development for Aboriginal communities is to get people to harness the power of positive thinking to become rich. And he teaches them about stillness, space, and gravity, and he leads seminars and workshops where there's a lot of meditation going on. And so 21 people from this community during the time that I was there signed up to be adepts of this Tolshi Sen, paid for by the Tribal Economic Development Group. And so the stillness, space, and gravity was quoting him. Now, some of this stuff is flash in the pan. If I were to go back today, is stillness, space, and gravity still being celebrated? Probably not. So not all of it's going to stick, but it is. What's striking about it is how assimilative it is of various things. And it's not because people necessarily encounter practitioners or have experienced it themselves. It's even just the internet. You can find stuff on the internet that's kind of interesting around all this and think about how you could bring it in. So obviously there's the interest in really different kinds of alternative therapies. The question is, and this is the dilemma that's most interesting to me, as an administrator, and the administrators here are savvy folks, and they see this and they think, some administrators say, we really don't want all this. But because these are, in some respects, religious expressions, how do you then start to go in and control and limit people's religious expressions if you don't feel like it's appropriate for the particular setting? And they're already navigating huge religious divides between the Christians who come for treatment and the traditional folks. The Christians aren't going to go participate in sweat lodges or pipe ceremonies in some instances because they think it's, you know, diabolical, right? So anyway, there's a lot of sensitivity around religious stuff, and yet it's the religious stuff that makes people sit up and take notice and think, this is what's going to help heal our people. So interesting dilemmas. Yeah. Sure.
Yeah, you were talking about sort of the self as a therapeutic project as a major focus of the lodge, and catharsis and self-disclosure and so on as being a part of how they see the therapy working. I was wondering, I was on the board of directors actually of a Native Healing Lodge in Toronto some years back, and very, very similar to this approach, the fairly traditional approach, mostly substance abuse, younger clients, residents they call them, 4-month inpatient stay. And but what they had as a model around what sounds like a similar model to this one was the sense of family, where they asked the residents to call the counselors auntie and uncle and so on. And they repeated the term reclamation a lot in terms of reclaiming Aboriginal identity and returning to the family. And so there was what they were really focusing on was reclaiming a sense of belonging. And people like, Roy Baumeister, psychologist, Florida State, talks about one of the basic human needs is having a sense of belonging. And I'm wondering if you picked up as maybe part of what was going on there was this sense of being part of a collective identity, a part of the group, of this belongingness, and whether that was either implicitly or at some level explicitly part of that. I'm curious.
I would say it was more implicit, but I think there. And I think, so obviously the concern about the post-colonial reclamation of Native identity is really clear and explicit by the folks who are practicing this. And there were certainly clients, too, who talked about learning more about what it meant to be Aboriginal, learning more about their own history, their own past. Some of the curriculum for the group sessions involved overviews of the 7 sacred traditions, the 7 sacred ceremonies, all the kinds of, so it was, in some sense, a cultural education component to the therapeutic services, explicitly targeting a reawakening and re-identification with the collectivity that is these people. Obviously, from what I'm telling you, what didn't seem as central to healing, at least in terms of how people talked about it, right? Because what people got to fairly quickly was this, the confession, the catharsis, and that kind of stuff. But it was definitely there in some important ways, and belonging probably came out even less so than identity as the proxy for belonging, but I think belonging is what it's about, yeah. And so that's an element that actually probably is certainly there, but more secondary in some ways to this respect. And it wouldn't be interesting to think about what it would mean to rebalance that, so that the belonging aspect, or the movement into if you will, a more functional, even in culturally local terms, kinship system or something, that in a way for it could be rehabilitative, is quite interesting. Yeah, I think that's a really neat thing, which probably because they're young people makes more sense, right? Over here, sure, Lisa.
When you were discussing the assumptions undergirding what healing means, and you're talking about emotional burdens, but it seemed that releasing some type of personal emotional pain, was there also a counterpart that came out in the conversations with these folks of releasing some kind of a collective or historical community level pain?
Well, it is always related to collective trauma, and it's because it's cast within the discourse of historical trauma or intergenerational trauma or colonial disruption, right? But what was interesting about this program is it was targeting residential school survivors, but I'm pretty sure it was none of the clients I talked to had gone to residential school. So it's kind of a generational thing where then to be eligible for the program, you had, and available for the Aboriginal Healing Foundation to pay for the program to begin with, you had to have at least the intergenerational consequences, sequela of residential school. And basically everyone in the community was understood to have that because your auntie or your grandpa or your great-grandfather had that. So I think a big part of this is obviously re-anchoring the stress, traumatic experience to the colonial encounter in a way that I think that helps to disrupt what many Aboriginal people in Canada would feel, which is, I'm deeply flawed personally or what have you. So yes, there is that reframing within the colonial trauma. But when it comes to actually talking about my personal pain, well, it's because my dad did this or my mom did that or my sister did that, right? And they did that because their parents and their grandparents didn't know how to parent because they'd gone to residential school, and they did the same thing. So but it wasn't, like, and among these clients, it wasn't, the priests actually abused me when I was forced to go to residential school at age 6, because these people hadn't experienced it in quite that way. So it was kind of an indirect reframing, a connection with the past and with the collectivity. But of course, it's my student and I are working on a paper on this. It's a damaged collectivity. It's a victimized collectivity. And it participates in this discourse in part because there's the question of reparations. You might know that Canada just settled with the residential school survivors to the tune of however many millions and millions of dollars to compensate folks for the trouble they went through, the pain, the heartache, all of that. But once you're in a legal frame of reference, well, then it's all about, if I'm not a victim, I'm not entitled to compensation. So there's all kinds of ways that forces, provoke ways, discursive ways of stamping out experience and reflecting and experiencing on that representation of that experience. Someone was here, please.
Yeah, I'm kind of putting together some of the thoughts you just mentioned about. One of them has to do with what you just mentioned in terms of looking at victimhood and the idea of claiming your own healing. And I guess I was wondering a little bit about, as far as theory goes, because as you said, I think more people are thinking about it in terms of themselves and their families and the impact in terms of healing or not healing. But I guess in terms of sovereignty and self-sovereignty, in terms of restoring their self-sovereignty and deciding on the course of their healing as a practice, rather than, again, thinking about victimhood and all of that. I was just wondering, as far as your research going forward, then, is that also going to be a part of it in terms of the politics or the political aspect of healing? And also because this program was put in place to as reparation, then must that also be a critical component of the work that goes forward?
Yeah, I like the second question a lot, right? Well, in terms of self-sovereignty, it's not a term that anyone used. In fact, when I spent time in Canada, they don't use that term very much, but they use other terms that probably are analogous, right? Although I don't know if they brought the analogous term to the level of selfhood. So that's kind of an interesting thing. How's that for the psychologization of a political concept, right? Self-sovereignty, right? But in terms of the fact that the program itself is reparation, and yeah, I don't think clients are aware of that. And I'm not even sure how much counselors think of it in those terms as this is a reparation. With the issue of reparations, it is about the financial payment. The real dilemma is what are the models that are out here, the extant ways of characterizing experience that acknowledge a wrong done, a harm inflicted, without having to almost celebrate victimhood for the purposes of getting attention and redress. Like, what are the ways to say, how can we talk about these either in resilience ways or certainly in honest ways about the true harm and damage done, but that don't require, like many Native communities I've interacted with in the States, who will write government grants to tell everyone how horribly messed up we are and dysfunctional, and all in the name of trying to get federal funds, because the more in need you are, the more likely you are. Well, this takes us right back to the the age-old tension between rights and needs, right? I mean, obviously as a society, or as societies, we want to be helpful and offer something to folks in need as mental health professionals. That's presumably what we're up to. But there's this whole other side to the activities we engage in, which has to do with the oppressive purposes of the state that get realized through, I don't just mean like Soviet-style gulag kind of thing. I mean, the mental health professions emerged out of philanthropy and into social work, in which the goal was to uplift the working classes by inserting usually women social work types to get them to adopt mainstream values and to go into their homes and to monitor and make sure that they're coming along here, and we'll throw resources this way, but if we can help you uplift. That was a huge radical reformation from philanthropy, by the way, which believed that the working classes were beyond help, and the best thing you do is Christian charity. But so the shift was that you could actually help people uplift, but it was still about tinkering and intruding and monitoring. And so one of the dilemmas I have in doing this kind of work is to what degree we can imagine offering help to people in desperate need, perhaps of help, who are certainly suffering, without reproducing the kinds of Foucauldian surveillance, which is interested in disciplining the soul, right? And I don't confess now to having exactly worked that out. But I think part of the answer lies in kind of more collaborative and empowering kinds of opportunities to create, at a community level, interventions that people themselves are involved in connecting to the past and deciding what to change for the future in very intentional ways and in very creative and imaginative ways, which require resources and a facilitated process and all that kind of stuff to happen. It's not that people can't do that. It's that there's not the impetus, the opportunity to really engage in that in some way that will produce something. And that's where I think community psychology as an alternative in some ways to clinical psychology can offer some help.
I don't have a background in counseling, but one of the things that I'm an academic advisor for undecided students. So, I mean, part of my work has also been having students realize their own agency within a situation and having to figure out, okay, so if I think about what my motives are, my aspirations are, and the issues that I have to deal with and going forward from here, it helps a whole lot if you see what you're doing, because you are able to act on that on your own terms.
Of course, there's a flip side of that, which has to do with the individualistic nature of higher education, in which individual agency is like the celebrated outcome, right? As opposed to what does my family want me to do, or how will I be useful to anybody, or what have you. Yeah, we get caught up all along, don't we? Here, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
It's so interesting because we have this group of Native American student affairs professionals here at the same time, and in some ways we do that work with, Native students in higher ed in terms of really like countering that individualism that is so pervasive in higher education, that sort of autonomy and your pathway in life is to evolve yourself from your current state of affairs and move forward and gain an education and gain riches and whatnot, and then what's funny is in these processes and these one-on-one sessions with students, this process happens. This is very holistic. Most of us do a lot of intervention and a lot of counseling, and also looking at self-determinant models for how to empower students. Very interesting.
I mean, I think as an interesting aside, we might want to look at what are the cultural assumptions underlying empowerment as a particular social goal, right? Exactly. And the last thing I'd say about that is, I'm an educator. I didn't think I wasn't trained to be an educator. I'm a psychologist, but I teach. I'm a professor. I teach undergraduates. And so what kind of pedagogy makes sense to offer folks? And on the one hand, I think the ideal of a liberal education, that is an education that is liberating, that teaches people to be free from the constraints and demands of authority and tradition and powerful people and so on, probably requires a reseeding of authority inward into the individual self, right? That how I benefit from a liberal education is learn to think critically and to become an independent authority, to be able to evaluate all claims myself and thereby be liberated from the priests or the politicians or whoever it is. But what does it mean to be liberated from tradition in the sense of what many Native communities want or desire for their peoples? And I wonder, what are the alternatives then? I mean, if you're an oppressed group of people, it's hard to imagine that you would want anything but a liberal education. I can't come up anyway with what you would have instead of a liberal education, right? Because that becomes the tool for subversion, for protest, for reimagination of something different. But it also obviously transforms you in some powerful ways. And I think that's the dilemma as an educator I face, thinking about education for Native people versus others.
I hate to do this, but we need to cut it off because we're over time. Please, I will say that Joe's going to be around for a little bit. You can catch him in mingling around. Please help me thank Joe for sessions.